Imagine this. You were born and raised in sub-Saharan Africa, and you're making a living as a subsistence farmer. You're living with none of the modern conveniences of a typical Western life. When war comes, you and your family are displaced, and after some time in a refugee camp, you're resettled in the United States. You will need to learn virtually everything: how to use a toilet, how to turn on a light, how to cross a street, how to speak a new language, and you need to learn new skills that will help you make a living in a completely alien world. Or let's move a bit closer to home. Imagine you're traveling in Berlin, Germany for the first time in many, many years. You thought you knew how to get from Alexanderplatz in the former East to the Zoogarten in the former West, but all that new construction means you are now thoroughly lost. You need to dredge up your high school German and use it to learn a new spatial map of the city. Or consider this. Through an unfortunate incident, you managed to break both your arms. With the casts on, you become aware of just how often your ways of moving around depend on your arms. You realize you've been using those arms to get in and out of cars, to go up and down staircases, to help you balance on trails. And now you're going to have to relearn how to do those things using different muscles and different movements. I'm Monisha Pashupathy, and this course is about how we learn. Let's begin by considering some of the ways you might think about learning. Although our a priori intuitions about how we learn may have grains of truth, they're often, to a larger extent than we realize, misconceptions, and they're based on an imperfect understanding of people and animals as learners. In much of this course, we will consider the ways in which we are right and wrong about how we learn. In this lecture, we'll define what it means to learn, and we'll discuss some concepts that are relevant for learning, maybe even close to the idea of learning, but which are not quite the same thing. Concepts like development and memory. I'll close by giving you a brief overview of the main point of the entire course, which is that learning is a complicated process that depends in part on what is being learned, how and why, and by whom. So first, some myths and abbreviated myth-busting about learning, and a sampling of some of the things we will discuss in greater depth in later lectures. Myth 1, learning is aware and purposeful. This is a myth in a couple ways. We don't always have awareness of the learning process or its outcomes. Sometimes you think you've learned how to do something, only to find, when push comes to shove, you haven't. Also, you learn all the time, and you often do so without awareness that you're learning. And you often do so without actually meaning to learn anything at all. The arm example above highlights this. You've learned to move using your arms without realizing that, until something happens and you have to learn to move without them. Here's another example. Imagine that you have several different pairs of glasses. Sometimes you get in the habit of wearing one pair consistently for a period of time, and then suddenly you remember, oh yeah, let me wear the purple glasses today. When you walk into the grocery store where you're a regular, recognized customer, your favorite clerk doesn't seem to recognize you. What's going on? Well, given her job, she was probably generally paying attention to your purchases and your overall appearance. But on some level, she learned how your face looks. Though she wasn't aware of it, and she didn't do it on purpose, what she learned about how your face looks was connected to a specific pair of glasses. When you changed glasses, you changed something about your face, and the clerk had difficulty recognizing you. She had learned one version of you with a particular pair of glasses, not the version with the purple glasses. Now, many people experience this from both sides, being recognized or not, or failing to recognize someone. When one minor thing has changed, we've learned something without awareness and without meaning to learn it. Myth 2, people, especially college-educated, smart people, basically already know how to maximize learning. This myth is related to the idea that learning is largely something we're aware of, and therefore something we know how to optimize. In fact, there's good evidence that people choose less than ideal strategies for learning, and my undergraduate students are no exception. Also, our judgments of what we've learned well, what we don't yet know, what we do and do not need to practice, are not as accurate as they could be. For example, our experience of learning as effortful may mislead our judgments of whether we've learned something. And consequently, our ideas about what we need to practice and what we can stop practicing are also wrong. This idea of not being completely good at judging our own learning is also linked to a third myth. Myth 3. When learning's going well, when we're really learning, we feel confident, successful, and clear. And in fact, the learning process is not quite that straightforward. Moments of confusion, frustration, uncertainty, and lack of confidence are part of the process of acquiring new skills and new knowledge. Often, moments of confusion and uncertainty are moments where you think, geez, is it really worth the effort to do this? Am I ever going to master this new thing? It feels like your brain and your mind are going in circles and like nothing is getting in. But learning is going on all the time, even in those less confident and clear and successful moments. And sometimes those moments are necessary before we achieve a new level of understanding. And in fact, this is related to another myth people often have. Myth 4. Emotion is a problem for rationality, and therefore getting emotional messes up learning. The idea that getting emotional messes up learning or makes it hard to learn may have a grain of truth as well. But it is probably more accurate, as we'll see, to see emotion as changing the orientation we have towards learning, narrowing our focus when we're learning, or broadening that focus out. When we are feeling angry or anxious, that may help us focus our attention very narrowly. When we're feeling good, we're likely to broaden out and make new connections more easily, maybe make more creative connections. So different types of learning and different learning situations may call for one or the other kind of focus. And the upshot is that emotion can help or hinder learning, depending on what emotions we're talking about and what's being learned. And again, this is something we'll focus on in more detail later in this course. Myth 5. If someone doesn't find something interesting, he or she won't or cannot learn it. We often think that interest helps learning, and in discussions of teaching, we often ask ourselves, how can we better engage students with this material? How can we make them want to learn it? And of course, it's true that being interested in learning something can help us learn it. And as we'll discuss in this class, people have things they can do to cultivate interest and engagement. There are ways to increase your motivation to learn. But here's a surprise. It turns out also that a little foundational learning can actually foster the development of interest. And that's another reason to stick it out through early frustration. Myth 6. People learn from getting rewarded and punished. Many of us think that we learn from consequences, and we sometimes treat our pets and our children in precisely this way. Now, there are many aspects of this myth that need more careful thought, as we will see in this course. First of all, people and animals explore their worlds for the sake of learning. Learning seems to be an innately motivated action. To name just one example, infants who are learning to walk experience a lot of painful consequences. They fall, they scrape themselves, and they cry about it. But this doesn't actually deter them from carrying on with the project of learning to walk. People will even try out actions they've seen other people do, and they'll do that if there isn't any obvious reason to do so. They'll do it just to find out what information they can get from doing that action. Try staring at the sky on a crowded sidewalk sometime. Passersby will stop and look because they want to know what's out there. They think something might be learned, and they don't want to miss out. Even for your dog, who learns to sit when you say sit, maybe after a lot of treats, the reward is not necessarily what's driving learning. The dog actually might figure out what you want with sit relatively quickly. Instead, what the reward does is to encourage the dog to demonstrate what he's learned. Now, you can't get in your dog's head to figure this out, but we will consider some experiments that make this idea of rewards causing learning seem less likely, and make the idea of rewards motivating the demonstration of learning more reasonable and more likely. Myth 7. Smart people learn more easily and better than less smart people. This is a myth to which, honestly, I partly subscribed prior to developing the course. It seems so logical that there are some of us who are smarter than others, those people who do very well on IQ tests, and that in fact being higher in IQ means you have an easier time learning new things. Later in this class, you will learn, as I did, that being smarter by scoring higher on IQ tests might actually mean you've already learned more, not necessarily that learning was easier for you in the first place. Myth 8. Learning is like opening up your brain and having stuff dumped into it. Learning is not passive, and it doesn't happen on an empty brain. We are transforming information in our environments all the time in order to learn. Some of those transformations are completely without our awareness. For example, patterns of light waves get transformed into your perception of edges, objects, and drop-offs without any awareness on your part. But your eye and brain are transforming sensory information in order for you to see the world. And then these pieces of information get further transformed into a mental map of your office or your building or your city. And at that point, you may be more aware of that transformation process. Further, in addition to all that transformation, learning actually depends a lot on prior knowledge and assumptions, because the transformations we make allow us to connect new experiences and new information to what we already know. Now, there's one really delightful example of this, and it comes from a study of golfers and non-golfers. And the people in this study were asked to learn and to remember different actions, like turn on the lamp or putt to the target. And as you can see, some items were golf-related and others weren't. Now, the items were given to the participants in one of three ways: as a sentence on a card, in a video on a computer, or the person was actually asked to do the task physically. Then, participants were asked which items they remembered as a test of learning. And as it turns out, golfers were superior at remembering golf actions. And this was really true when they had actually learned the actions by doing them. Now, for our present consideration of this myth, what's important is why golfers might have an easier time learning golf-relevant actions. Now, they were not superior at learning other actions. They were just like non-golfers. They weren't smarter in general, and they weren't more interested in general. But here's the thing. For the golfers, putting to a specific target in a room has many more connections to their own experience and their expertise. To golfers, the golf clubs are more distinctive. They can make comparisons of the putt to known golf courses, and all of that draws on their prior learning of golf. Moreover, all of that makes each enacted golf action distinctive and easily learned and recalled, but only for golfers. Myth 9. People of all ages learn basically the same way. Learning is learning. So I can teach my preschooler grandchild about science the same way I would teach my adult child with simpler concepts, right? No. This is another myth. There is enormous evidence that people of different ages learn somewhat differently, for several reasons. Now, first, if we just learn today, learning depends on prior knowledge, then kids and adults have different prior knowledge of the world. And second, the ability to reflect on what we are learning, to think critically as we're in the process of learning, develops. It's not something younger kids can do easily, and it may not be something that young kids can be taught to do. Rather, the brain matures from birth to adulthood in ways that allow us to engage in critical thinking about evidence and sources of information as we learn. In childhood, the brain has more limited capacity for that kind of critical reflection, and that in turn affects how kids learn. Also, as we'll see, the learning limitations go in both directions. There are things babies are good at learning and adults are not so good, like language. And there are things adults are capable of learning to do, like evidence-based reasoning, and young kids are not so competent at learning, even with a lot of help. Myth 10. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. Well, that last myth was the idea that age doesn't matter for learning. But there are also myths about age making all the difference. And these myths usually point to the idea that learning new things is something only children do well. My guess is that by being in the audience, you don't endorse this myth. But let me underscore that this is a myth. Given good health, even people who are very old are able to learn new things. Consider this example. Weight training and balance training interventions are being employed with frail, nursing home dwelling elderly populations. Now, these interventions are aimed at improving strength and balance, preventing falls, and reducing the likelihood of broken bones. But here's the catch. They require that people learn new things. They require that people acquire a new movement skill, learn exercise sequences, and acquire new muscle capabilities, and that's also learning. And even this most vulnerable population can do this successfully. Now, I can give you another example, and this one is closer to how we typically think of learning. 2 of the recent PhD graduates in the program where I teach were 50 or older at the time they received their degree. Now, to get that degree, they had to master statistical techniques that were not even developed when they were 20. They had to acquire knowledge related to their interests, one in cardiovascular health and stress, a high-tech, biologically oriented area of our field, and they had to master that knowledge so well that they're now deemed ready to expand what we know with their own independent research. In talking with one of these women recently, I came to discover that in her lifetime, she'd worked as a bank teller, raised 5 children, run her own business, provided full-time care for an aging parent, and returned to college in roughly that order. Now, when I put it this way, she sounds utterly extraordinary, doesn't she? But the fact is that in each of those successive lives, she simply was open to the idea of learning something new and willing to invest energy and time in doing so. And in my most recent undergraduate class, I had a student in his 70s. His scores on the exams were so high relative to his much younger peers, and one explanation was that he was simply brilliant. But it turned out when I spoke with him about how he was getting this incredible level of performance on the exams, he just had very strong study skills. So much so that I asked him to explain to others what he did to prepare for tests, so they could do likewise. He was studying the material a little at a time, every day, and connecting it to other things he knew. Now, as we'll discuss in this class, learning does change as we age. There are changes in how quickly we learn. Something my 70-year-old undergraduate student noted about his own studying was that it took him more time than it would have when he was a young man. And also, there are changes in what we care about and are interested in learning, so it's not that learning is the same in old age as when we are 20. But the important message here is that learning is possible for people across the lifespan. So old dogs are always learning new tricks, provided they want to do so, and provided they take the time. While I could go on with myths of learning, in this first lecture on how we learn, I would also like to lay out some important concepts that I'd like you to keep in mind throughout the course. Now, first of all, what is learning? We just swept through things like recognizing faces, learning lists of actions and remembering them, issues of interest, of golf knowledge, of language learning, and even the idea that lifting weights involves acquiring muscle skills. Dictionary definitions of learning define it as a change in a person's understanding, knowledge, or abilities that arises from the person's experience. And that's a good definition to start with. Here's why. It encompasses things we learn consciously and know that we've learned, like changes in understanding and knowledge, and things we might acquire in a less conscious way, like learning how someone's face looks. It focuses on change, which gives us a way of thinking about how to tap into learning. And it emphasizes that learning comes from experience. At the end of the course, we'll revisit the definition and we'll think again about whether it encompasses the points that we've raised along the way. Next, Learning is easy to confuse with some other things, and in particular here I'm concerned with confusing learning with development and confusing learning with memory. What is the difference between learning and development? Development can be defined in ways that actually include learning as one of the ways development happens, and in ways that exclude learning from the idea of development, and that's why this difference is somewhat tricky. In this course, we'll think about the difference between development and learning in this way. We will view development as referring primarily to brain-based maturation, changes in abilities that are going to happen regardless of the specific experiences that a child has. And what we shall see is that most changes from childhood through old age combine developmental processes, like the maturation of our brains, with specific experiences that we learn from. And so most of what changes about our lives involves some combination of maturation and learning. For example, kids all need to learn to wait patiently for their turn at, say, a drinking fountain. Now, they learn this from experiences where adults tell them to wait and help them to wait patiently without shoving. And they also learn it from experiences of being pushed and shoved, which they usually don't find very nice. But children can't quite master patiently waiting their turn until their brain has developed an ability to inhibit or to suppress a behavior that you want to do. So you have to both learn what is appropriate behavior through your experiences and have the brain maturity that lets you do what's appropriate and not what may be more desired, like shoving ahead to get the first turn. Another way to think about this is that development is not the same as learning, but learning is one major contributor to development. Learning is also not memory. Memory is our ability to store and recall past experiences in various ways, and learning is the acquisition of new information and abilities. However, you can see that these two concepts have what Patricia Bauer, a noted researcher of children's memory development, she calls it a horse and carriage relationship. Without memory, we can't keep what we learn. And in fact, without memory, there would not be learning. And in many, many, many cases, we know we've learned because we can recall information. In this course, we won't cover memory research in detail, and we will especially not spend much time addressing how memory works. But we will often draw on findings from memory work to illustrate aspects of learning, because in many cases, memory is how we know people have learned. For example, suppose you want to learn about the role of nutrition in the rising rates of obesity in our Western industrialized society. Now, you might go about learning this by reading articles in the newspaper or in journals. You might discuss those articles. You might talk to experts or your family physician. You might consult Professor Google, and so on. Lots of ways that you could go about acquiring this knowledge. Now, if I wanted to know what you've learned, I need to give you some kind of test. An essay exam, a multiple choice test, and if this is sounding a little bit like a college class example, I'm sticking to what I know here. I'm going to take exam performance as an indicator of what you've learned. But you also have to draw on the capacity to remember, to store and recall experiences of reading and learning about obesity in order to perform well on that exam. So learning is your acquisition of that new knowledge, but to say that knowledge has been acquired, we also mean that you can store and recall it using memory systems. Before I move on to some notes about how the course is organized, I wanted to make one last important note for you, and this one is about learning and the brain. Learning both changes the brain and depends very intimately on the kinds of changes that have already occurred in the brain, our store of knowledge. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time discussing brain-based work in this course because there's so much more to say about how we learn just in terms of our behaviors. But learning is a way of changing the brain, and the brain allows us enormous sophistication and flexibility in the learning process. So now, to the course. Learning, the acquisition of new knowledge or skills from experience, is a complex process, and otherwise we could cover it in a single lecture. The way we are going to approach that complexity is this way. We're going to say that learning depends on what is learned, how and why, and by whom. In the opening part of the course, we will spend a little time on the history of research on learning, because for a while, researchers tried to pretend that learning was one simple process, and we could apply it to pigeons, rats, people, and some slobbering dogs. And this didn't work. Then we'll talk a little bit about how learning is neither passive, it's not pouring information into an empty brain, and there's no tabula rasa, no blank slate in learning. After that, we'll move on to consider what is learned. Learning can involve skills or knowledge, visual or verbal information, just to name a few distinctions. Not everything is learned in quite the same way, and not everything is equally easy for us to learn. We learn motor skills and language in ways that have both overlaps and differences. We learn how to get around our city in ways that are comparable to learning how to tell a story, but also distinct. Of course, what we're learning in part determines how and why it's learned, and this is something we'll address in the 4th section of the course. We'll consider some of the basic cognitive abilities that allow learning, along with the way we learn both information, what, and context, where, how, and from whom, but not equally well. And we'll also look at the role of emotion and motivations and goals in learning. Perhaps most importantly, in this section of the course, we will look at people's ability to judge their own learning and to make strong strategy choices about how to learn better. The final section of the course will deal with individual differences. Who's learning? We've all been in a learning situation and envied the person next to us who seemed to do things so effortlessly and well right away. What is the difference between us and that individual? Is it that the person is smarter? Are they more motivated by the material they're learning? Do they have a different learning style, one that fits better with the instructor? Is it because they're older and more experienced, or younger and more energetic? Along the way, we'll extract information that helps each of us to learn more effectively and more deliberately, as well as to just deeply appreciate how amazingly capable we are of learning. In the next lecture, we'll take a brief historical tour of early work on learning. We will see that the research findings in this area taught us a great deal about learning, even if the way we interpret those findings has changed over time.